We are now directing our attention to several conservation strategies. And with regards to conserving landscape, conserving land, one of the things we have to realize is that as much as we want to conserve as much habitat as possible, we cannot conserve everything because there is going to be always a need for areas to continue expanding for urban development. But this can be done in a way that can favor the existence of species. We don't have to necessarily be putting wildlife and biodiversity in danger. One of the things that happens with regards to the disturbance of habitat and using land for agricultural purposes or for urban development is that it's always going to end up forming little patches of land. Here you can see tropical forest and how, because of the clearing of the trees, has produced some small patches. There's going to be some slightly larger patches, and sometimes there's going to be some even larger patches. And so the decisions have to be about what do we preserve? How do we save land in a way that allows for the continued use of the resources, but at the same time setting aside habitat for the conservation of biodiversity. So when you look at fragmentation, it is important to consider that the edges are going to be important for many different types of species. For example, white-tailed deer likes to inhabit edges of forests and meadows or disturbed habitat because they can benefit from the grazing in the open areas, but at the same time seek shelter and protection in the wooded areas. Similarly, I have studied species in grassland, and by now you probably realize the professor likes, your professor likes grassland, and that's because that's what I did most of my research on. And when you look at grassland species, many times grassland is going to be at the edges of forests or at the edges of scrub land or shrubs. And that's going to be places where there's going to be a higher degree of diversity because you have the merging of two different habitats, and that can bring also a more diverse type of resources species can use. So one has to consider that when we are saving fragments of land, we also want to conserve some of the edges around those fragments because of those species that can benefit from it. The problem with fragmentation is that if the fragments get too small, then they cannot support a large number of species. So the larger the fragment, the better it's going to be in terms of biodiversity. One of the hypotheses that I studied when I was doing my graduate research is the theory of island biogeography. According to this theory, fragments of land are going to be like islands in an ocean. A fragment of a forest, a fragment of grassland, or any other kind of land habitat is going to be surrounded by other areas that are going to be like an ocean. And so, for example, between a patch of forest and the next patch of forest, the space in between is going to be like the ocean. Islands become then like a group of islands, like an archipelago on land, except that, remember, we're talking about patches of habitat on land. And then what we have studied and what I discovered also through my research is that the larger a fragment of grassland is, a greater number of bird species and mammals and reptiles and amphibians. I was focusing on the study of vertebrate diversity in grassland habitat. And so this graph you see here, please keep in mind that this is going to be a logarithmic scale. The number of species is going to be increasing as the size of the area, the size of the patch or fragment is going to be increasing. And it's really consistent. It's surprising. This graph is not for the research that I did, but when I was studying grasslands of Southern California, I discovered that you need a minimum patch of about 10 hectares for species, grassland species, to be there in abundance. So it's just amazing how this theory of island biogeography helps us explain that, yes, indeed, the larger the fragment, the better it is in terms of biodiversity. Corridors are going to be sometimes necessary to connect islands. In this case, imagine this side of the highway as an island and this other side of the highway as an island of habitat. But the ocean in between, which is the highway, will be one that many species that move on land will never be able to cross because obviously they will become roadkill. And so when highways are being designed, and you can find this along I-90 near the summit, there are going to be some of these corridors that allow for species to move from one side of the highway to another side of the highway. It is a controversial strategy because for the longest time, it seemed like a waste of money. People were building corridors between patches of land, between islands of habitat, and the species were not moving through. But the thing is that many times uh, terrestrial mammals, terrestrial reptiles, they have to discover that this uh, option is available before they begin using it. So with time, corridors can become really effective at connecting different habitat islands, different patches of land, and helping alleviate the problem of habitat fragmentation. Hotspots are going to be another place where we can focus our attention in terms of conserving some habitat. Remember, we can't save it all. And so lately, a lot of the strategies in terms of obtaining land and setting it aside for conservation purposes deals with concentrating on hotspots. This illustration you see here shows many of the hotspots for biodiversity that are found around the world. And so you can see that Central America, that's where my little country of Salvador is, a good part of Mexico, and then all of the Pacific of the United States, the Pacific Northwest are going to be places where we have a large concentration of species in a relatively small amount of land. Notice also how in the ocean, there's going to be also places with hotspots for biodiversity. And you can see some of those triangles illustrated here in this map showing you where those places are going to be. So since we cannot save everything, then funds and resources and efforts should be invested in saving places where you can save a greater number of species as opposed to those places that don't support large numbers of species. That is the idea behind some nature reserves. When you look at this map of Costa Rica, an example I mentioned in another presentation, this is a place where forests were decimated to about 21% in the 1970s. And now the country has rebounded in terms of the amount of forest habitat. It's approximately 50% now. And as I mentioned before, the advantages is now that many of the species that had their numbers declining have now rebounded, and conservation has been done in a way that citizens have been trained to care, appreciate for wildlife, and as a consequence of the ecotourism coming into many towns, the livelihood, the standard of living for many small communities that used to be impoverished, now they're actually having a better standard of living. Costa Rica is going to be one of the places in Latin America with the highest levels of literacy, which means that the country is being able to provide more education at the elementary school level. And this also helps in terms of educating people on the value of natural resources. What you see in this map is going to be the darker green areas, which are going to be protected pieces of land. And remember that when we are protecting a particular hotspot for biodiversity, we also want to take into account the nature of the landscape surrounding that reserve. So because of there are those species that are going to be using the edges, it is also important to save, to conserve some of the areas around the nature reserves. Here in the United States, you are familiar with the idea of national parks. There's also national wildlife refuges. that are set aside for the conserving of wildlife, particularly in places where there is a greater number of species in a relatively small area. So that's something that can be done also. We can shift our efforts to identifying these hotspots for biodiversity and turning them into nature reserves. Urban ecology is also really important. Urban ecology is basically utilizing the resources that are in urban developed areas and protecting the organisms that have managed to adapt to the changing habitat. Restoration projects in urban development sometimes involve the planting of native species in parks, reintroducing trees that used to be present in the place but were once eliminated. Replanting those trees is one of the strategies, because with that, birds and other organisms that depend on the resources from those native trees are also going to make a comeback. One of the examples I can tell you about is the Duwamish Alive Coalition, which has been working for decades now in restoring or helping improve the quality of the water in the lower Duwamish watershed. This here is going to be the Duwamish Greenbelt, and South Seattle College will be over here off to one side. This is the largest continuous green belt in the Puget Sound area. And so South Seattle College, professors, students, we have been involved in the eliminating of exotic alien species that have been brought into this Duwamish Greenbelt. Some of those include that Himalayan blackberry that you are familiar with, and also planting trees. All of this used to be coniferous rainforests. So we had a lot of red cedar, and we had also a lot of white pine trees, and then those were eventually cut out and replaced by deciduous forests, like the trees that lose their leaves in the fall. And so what we have been doing in the part of land that is right next to South Seattle College is planting more of the native trees to restore the habitat to what it once used to be, or at least try to improve it in a way that resembles more closely what it used to be, in efforts of attracting then the wildlife that used to be present in those areas as well. If you are interested in what the Duwamish Alive Coalition is doing, you can click on this hyperlink, and then you can find ways in which you can also get active. I encourage you to do that. I will create one more presentation to deal with environmental challenges and changes that are taking place in our planet. But in terms of conservation of landscapes, this is all that I have.